For 2 decades, 3 men held the sport of tennis in the palm of their hand. Roger Federer made the game look like poetry written in slow motion. Rafael Nadal turned clay courts into personal battlefields soaked in sweat and willpower. And Novak Djokovic simply refused to lose, grinding opponents into dust with a smile on his face. Between them, they collected 66 Grand Slam titles. They left nothing behind. They ate the sport whole and asked for seconds. Most experts agreed it would take another generation, maybe 2, before anyone dared to challenge that throne. They were wrong. It took one teenager from a small Spanish town that most people couldn't find on a map. His name is Carlos Alcaraz, and by the age of 22, he had done something that Federer never did, something that Nadal never did, something that Djokovic, despite 24 Grand Slam titles and a career spanning 3 decades, never managed to pull off. He became the youngest man in tennis history to win all 4 Grand Slams. Not the youngest in the modern era, the youngest in the entire history of the sport. A record that had stood since 1938 was broken by a kid who started playing tennis because his dad handed him a racket and told him to go outside. This is the story of how that happened. Palmar is a quiet municipality on the southeastern edge of Spain, tucked into the region of Murcia, where the air smells like oranges and the summers are brutal. It is not the kind of place that produces global superstars. There are no skyscrapers, no academies of international fame, no tradition of sending its sons and daughters to conquer the world. What Palmar does have is a local tennis club, the Real Sociedad Club de Campo de Murcia, and it was here, on the red clay courts that his family had called home for generations, that Carlos Alcaraz Garcia first picked up a racket. He was 3 years old, maybe 4. The stories vary, depending on who is telling them. What everyone agrees on is that the moment Carlos Alcaraz Gonzalez, the father, a former professional tennis player turned coach, the man who ran the club's athletic program, placed a racket in his son's hands, something immediately clicked. The kid did not fumble. He did not swing wildly at air. He hit the ball, and then he hit it again, and then he refused to stop. Carlos Alcaraz was the second of 4 sons. His great-uncle had been a member of that same club. His grandfather too. Tennis was not a dream in the Alcaraz household. It was furniture. It was simply part of the room. What was unusual was the speed at which the youngest Carlos began to outgrow the room entirely. By the time he was 10 years old, he had already become the regional under-10 champion. Coaches who saw him at that age have since described a kind of coordinative intelligence that is almost impossible to teach. The ability to read the trajectory of a ball, to position the body before the mind has processed the instruction, to make the game look slower than it actually is. By the time he was 12, the sports management agency IMG had already identified him and offered him a contract. He was 12 years old. The ink was barely dry on his primary school diploma. The Spanish junior circuit was not enough to hold him. He traveled across Europe, absorbing different surfaces, different opponents, different styles of play. He was winning regularly, but winning on the junior circuit and winning on the ATP sure are 2 entirely different sports. What Alcaraz needed was not just talent. He already had that in abundance. What he needed was a mentor who had stood on the biggest stages in the world and knew exactly what it felt like when the ground starts to shake beneath your feet. He found that mentor on the outskirts of a small inland town called Villena, about an hour's drive from Murcia. Juan Carlos Ferrero was not simply a good coach who happened to be available. Juan Carlos Ferrero was a former World No.1, a Roland Garros champion, a man who had navigated the same waters that young Carlos was preparing to enter. The ruthless, exhausting, politically complex world of professional tennis at the very highest level. Ferrero had built his academy in Villena into something that felt less like a training facility and more like a small village dedicated to one purpose: producing tennis players of exceptional quality. The ground stretched across more than 1,000 square meters, 25 courts, clay and hard surface, threaded through landscaped gardens, a physiotherapy clinic, a fully equipped gym, nutritionists, sports psychologists, student accommodation. More than 100 players lived there on a permanent basis. When a teenage Carlos Alcaraz first arrived at those gates in 2018, 15 years old, small for his age, and still adjusting to the demands of elite professional training, he was walking into the most serious tennis environment in Spain, outside of the Rafa Nadal Academy. The early arrangement was a hybrid. Alcaraz would commute from Murcia to Villena several days each week, then return home to his family, his school, his friends, the ordinary machinery of a teenager's life. But ordinary and Carlos Alcaraz were already parting ways. The development under Ferrero was not gradual. It was a controlled explosion. Ferrero identified immediately that Alcaraz possessed something that could not be manufactured in a gym or taught on a practice court. the instinct to compete, not just to perform. Many talented young players can execute beautifully in training. They unravel when the score matters. Alcaraz was the opposite. He became more precise under pressure, not less. Ferrero's job was not to build this quality. It already existed. His job was to build everything around it. The footwork, the tactical patience, the serve, the mental architecture that would allow a teenager to stand across the net from the most experienced players in the world and refuse to blink. The ATP Tour is not a place that welcomes teenagers gently. It is a professional environment populated by grown men who have spent years developing the specific skills required to dismantle opponents, and who do not adjust their approach simply because the player walking onto the court is 16 years old and still in school. When Alcaraz made his ATP Tour debut in February 2020 at the Rio Open, nobody in the locker room was particularly worried. Young players debut on tour every year. Most of them lose a few matches, collect some experience, and go back to the challenger circuit to develop for another couple of years. Alcaraz did not go back. He stayed. He started winning, and the players, who initially saw a talented but manageable teenager, quickly discovered that something about this particular kid was deeply inconvenient. In May 2021, he broke into the ATP Top 100. The following months confirmed that this was not a statistical accident. He reached his first ATP final at the Croatia Open. He won his first ATP title shortly after, becoming, at 18, the youngest Spanish champion in 17 years. He capped the year by winning the Next Generation ATP Finals in Milan, a tournament for the 8 best players aged 21 and under. It was not a grand slam, but it was a signal, a clear, unambiguous signal that something new had arrived. The 2022 season turned the signal into an announcement that no one could ignore. In the spring of 2022, Carlos Alcaraz walked into the Madrid Open as a 19-year-old. He had been playing well, but nobody had prepared the tennis world for what happened that week. In the quarterfinals, Alcaraz faced Rafael Nadal, his childhood idol, his compatriot, a man who had won the Madrid Open 5 times and who, at that point in 2022, was competing at a level that even his rivals admitted was frightening. The match was physical, the kind that leaves marks on a player's body for days afterward. Alcaraz twisted his ankle in the second set. Nadal raised his level, as Nadal always does when blood is in the water. The set went to Nadal. Then Alcaraz did something that veterans of the sport rarely do, let alone teenagers. He came back. He closed the match 6-2, 1-6, 6-3. His idol went home. 2 days later, having survived that war, Alcaraz stepped onto the court against Novak Djokovic in the semifinals. The world number 1, the man who had won 20 Grand Slams by that point. The match went 3 hours and 35 minutes. Alcaraz won. The tennis world, which had been slowly paying attention over the previous months, stopped what it was doing entirely. In 1 week, at 19 years old, he had beaten both Nadal and Djokovic, back-to-back. He had done it without the benefit of a hot draw, without the advantage of playing below his best on bad days for his opponents. Both men brought their best. Alcaraz brought something more. The Rio Open title in February had been his first ATP 500. The Miami Open followed, his first Masters 1000 title. The Barcelona Open after that. By the time September arrived and Alcaraz walked out onto the hard courts of Flushing Meadows for the US Open final against Casper Ruud, he was already the most talked about player in the sport. What happened next rewrote history in real time. Alcaraz won. He won the US Open. He became the youngest player in 32 years to claim that title. And when the final point landed, and the scoreboard updated, and the crowd at Arthur Ashe Stadium processed what they had just witnessed, the ATP rankings updated too. Carlos Alcaraz, 19 years old, became the number 1 ranked men's tennis player in the world. The youngest in the history of the ATP rankings. Not the youngest in a decade. Not the youngest since the computer rankings began in a particular format. The youngest ever. At 19 years and 4 months, he held the top position in a sport that Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic had dominated so completely that many assumed the number 1 ranking would not leave that circle of 3 for years. It had left, and it had gone somewhere nobody expected, to a teenager from Palmar, who used to hit tennis balls against a wall until his parents told him to come inside for dinner. The years that followed were not a steady march of triumph. This is the part of the story that separates the mythology from the reality, the part that the highlight reels do not capture. Alcaraz learned what it meant to carry the weight of expectation at the highest level, and he learned it in real time, in front of millions of people. There were early exits. There were moments of vulnerability that opponents tried to exploit. There were tournament draws that went wrong at the worst possible moment. The tennis world, which is never short of opinions, debated endlessly whether Alcaraz could maintain consistency against the best in the world over a full season, across all surfaces, under the particular kind of pressure that builds when every opponent on the tour has spent months studying your game specifically to find the crack in the wall. They found fragments. They could not find the crack. In July 2023, Alcaraz walked into Wimbledon as a 20-year-old with one Grand Slam title to his name. The final that awaited him was Novak Djokovic, who had won Wimbledon 4 consecutive times and who arrived at center court as the most dominant player on grass in the history of the sport. The first set went to Djokovic. It was not particularly close. Alcaraz adjusted. The second set went to a tiebreak. Alcaraz won it. The third set was not competitive. Alcaraz dominated. Djokovic found another gear in the fourth. Alcaraz found one more. The fifth set went to the man who had spent the day proving that, on the most famous tennis court in the world, 20 years old is not too young to be the best player alive. The grass of Wimbledon had now been claimed. One surface down. 3 Grand Slams in the collection. The French Open would follow in 2024, making him the youngest male player ever to win a major on all 3 surfaces, clay, grass, and hard court, a feat known as the Surface Slam, achieved at 21 years of age. And then, in February 2026, came the Australian Open. The significance of what happened at Melbourne Park on that February night cannot be understood without knowing the company Alcaraz was joining. The career Grand Slam, winning all 4 major tournaments at least once, is the sport's highest individual achievement. Only 8 men in the Open era had completed it before Alcaraz walked out onto the Rod Laver Arena. Rafael Nadal completed his at 24 years old. Roger Federer was 27. Novak Djokovic, despite his 24 Grand Slams, never completed the career slam at all. The Australian Open eluded him for different reasons over the years, but the record he had never needed. What Djokovic had collected in volume, Alcaraz was collecting in history. Standing across the net was Djokovic himself, 10-time Australian Open champion, a man who had never lost a final at Melbourne Park. The first set confirmed that the Serbian had not arrived to cooperate with history. He broke twice, won the set in 33 minutes, never faced a break point. It looked, briefly, like the kind of match where youth is reminded of its limits by experience that has no intention of stepping aside. Then Alcaraz cut down his unforced errors. 9 in the first set, 10 combined in the next 2 sets. He broke Djokovic twice in the second set, twice in the third. A single set from completing the most prestigious record in his sport, the young Spaniard held his nerve through a fourth set that swung back and forth like a pendulum neither man could control. With Djokovic serving at 5-6, needing to hold to stay in the match, Alcaraz generated his first match point. Djokovic's forehand went into the net, then another. The match was over. Carlos Alcaraz, 22 years old, had become the youngest man in the history of tennis to complete the career Grand Slam. The previous record had been held since 1938, 88 years. Don Budge, who set that mark, had been 22 years and 11 months old. Alcaraz was 22 years and 8 months. 3 months separated him from history, and history moved. He had done what Federer never did, what Nadal never did, what Djokovic, across 46 Grand Slam finals, had not managed to complete. And he had done it wearing the expression of a man who still cannot quite believe his luck, the same expression